大家好, I'm Nathan Rich, aka 火锅大王. You know, I've been hearing a lot of stuff online about the H1N1 virus and the coronavirus and SARS, and I wanted to line up the timeline that I made about the coronavirus with the timeline about the H1N1 virus and see how they match up. We've already talked about the fact that China's handling of this current outbreak is way faster and better than it was back in 2003 for the SARS epidemic. The H1N1 virus is not similar to this new coronavirus. It's an influenza, and it has a much, much lower mortality rate. Some of the colors are the same as the last video that I did. I've also added red to show something that was slower, and I've added white to show something which was done faster. And I've also added orange to show items which, in retrospect, were probably mistakes. So let's take a look at some of the differences between the H1N1 timeline and the COVID-19 timeline. This is the timeline that I used for the coronavirus before. There's a few changes. I've deleted many items that are not big, sweeping changes. So maybe a meeting or whatever, I've deleted all that kind of stuff. I've added here at the bottom the H1N1 virus. The 26th of December 2019 is the first time that doctors noticed that something strange was happening with a patient. I've shifted all the days from the H1N1 virus up till now, and I've linked it with these two items. We can't really talk about the reaction of a country before they knew something. It has to be after someone has detected something strange with this patient. The real date of this is March 28th, 2009. This is when the first patient was identified as having a flu, which didn't seem normal, and they were transferred to get more special attention. This is the first time that somebody in the United States noticed that something was wrong with a patient that didn't seem to be the normal flu. This person was a kid, and the kid had a cousin, and that cousin got sick before she did. That cousin got sick here 3 days before she did. Somewhere around January of 2009 was later suspected to be the first case or cases in Mexico. The outbreak began somewhere around March 9th, 2009 in Mexico. So a lot of people will try to use the fact that this outbreak technically started in Mexico to divert your attention away from America. That's a disingenuous argument, because if we find that the COVID-19 outbreak started in another country, that doesn't change any of our commentary on how China has reacted to it. By the time the United States had noticed its first strange case, Mexico knew that some people were sick, but they didn't know that it was a novel flu virus. We could say that that timeline for them looks pretty bad. So you can definitely criticize Mexico's early response. They will probably tell you that they didn't know, so it's a bit tricky. But whatever the case, we do know that in the United States, there was a case in Southern California, outside of San Diego, in which a child was sick, and they didn't think that it was the normal flu. Something seemed wrong. And so that is linked up with here in China when Dr. Zhang noticed something is weird with these 4 cases. You'll see that the deaths graph up here for COVID-19, this has a curve to it. That's because these are the real numbers. Meanwhile, you'll notice that US cases and world cases doesn't have a curve. And the reason for that is there's no data that's accurate day to day for the cases. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But just so you understand, the real progression of cases obviously would have had like a cubic or a quadratic curve to them, not a straight line, not linear. Okay, so we know that there was one case, and this number 61 is not accurate. The real truth is we have no idea how many cases there were, but it's probably something like that, 50, 60. The United States gets this strange case. What do they do about it? The equivalent first public mention would have happened on the 18th of January, 2020, which is in fact almost 3 weeks longer than the first public mentions here in China. Now, there is a chance they didn't realize there was a problem with this girl that day. It could have been a day or two later. But even if it were a day or two later, most of these red items will still be red. China's first mention to the public about the cases was here, whereas America's was here. The first building being closed, in this case, was a school. And that was also around 3 weeks after the time that the market in Wuhan was closed. The new virus was identified about 8 days later than China. The first confirmation of a case was 2 days later. So this is kind of within the margin of error. This might have been around the same, but it could have been around 2 days later. Epidemic Operations Center opened. This is about 3 days later than the Chinese. The other thing to note here is that there's not really anything else happening. They mention it. They open a control center for it. They identify the virus. I mean, there's not really anything happening. A school is closed. It's very, very slow. When we look at the China side, even with many, many things removed, it still looks more aggressive. It even looks more aggressive in this area, which I previously said was probably not aggressive enough. So let's continue. Around the time that Dr. Zhong was sent down to Wuhan, and China was giving free treatment at all hospitals for all flu symptoms, and Wuhan already had rolled out infrared thermometers to airports, railway stations, coach stations, and passenger terminals, still nothing really had happened in America. They really didn't do much. And there was a report that came out around that time that said it's too late to contain it. Here, around the 21st of January, equivalent time, Mexico began a massive lockdown. They had a lot of cases and they just started locking everything down. They were closing public spaces and stadiums and theaters and nightclubs and everything. They even had soldiers going around giving masks to people. So they were really pushing for masks. They were pushing for all the stuff you would expect during an outbreak. They were becoming very aggressive. So in the beginning, whether they knew or not, we're not sure. But if they did know, obviously that was a major failure for them. But by this point, they really turned everything around and started to be extremely aggressive towards the virus. Meanwhile, in America, Time reported that there's no need for a travel ban because illegal aliens will just come anyway. And the CDC kind of backed up the previous report by saying containment in the USA is not likely. Nothing really has been done. Maybe a few things here and there, some warnings, some schools and things started to slow down. People were getting a little nervous, but there really wasn't any actual action happening. The Department of Health and Human Services declares public health emergency, but says that sounds more severe than it really is. Here, first orange item, the president says H1N1 is, quote, not a cause for alarm. And you can see now it's starting to spread. Canada, Spain, United Kingdom. The CDC declines shutting borders down, and they seem to ignore international spread potential. Now, what do I mean by that? They talk about why they're not going to close the borders, and their reason is essentially it won't help less Americans get cases.
As President Obama said this morning, swine flu is a cause for concern, but not a cause for alarm. With respect to closing the border, again, you would close the border if you thought you could contain disease, the spread of disease, but the disease already is in a number of states within the United States, so the containment issue doesn't really play out.
They don't even seem to consider the concept of, yeah, but what about the rest of the world? So to me, this is a huge mistake. CNN reports that normal flu is more deadly than H1N1 in the US. You can sort of see the atmosphere is you have a lot of these reports basically telling everybody don't panic, it's no big deal. Regular flu is worse, no need to close the borders, not a cause for alarm. Then, when the first death happens, you start to see schools are being closed down, more spreading. And interestingly, the WHO declared this a public health emergency of international concern much earlier than they did in the Chinese case. That's this white line. So this is the equivalent time that it happened in the current case, and this is the equivalent time that it happened in the H1N1 case. So we have schools shutting down. This is basically the first big action taken. And we're already, by the way, deep into this timeline. And this is the first major thing that's actually happening. 100 schools are closing down, and then 300 schools. And here's the first case in China. The transportation secretary says it is safe to fly and basically don't cancel flights. Meanwhile, it spreads to France.
Even the transportation secretary came forward to say it is safe to fly, and he urged Americans not to cancel flights unless they suspect they have the flu.
And it's around this time that Mexico's extremely aggressive efforts start to pay off. The new cases start to decline a bit, they get a little bit of relief. So we can see by this timeline that it took them about a week to get things under control with a very aggressive tactic. They were even criticized for being too aggressive with it. And they made a big impact. But as you can see, it gets a lot worse. I think, especially because the CDC not shutting the borders down, and this, the transportation secretary encouraging people to fly. Here we see Mexico was accused of knowing about the outbreak for almost a month before anybody else knew about it. Here we have, again, the CDC suggests that schools should reopen. A lot of nothing, just spreading and spreading and spreading, spreading, spreading. And I want to point out now that today is this black line. So by today, in this timeline, basically the only thing America's done is close some schools, then say that they should be open again, and encourage people not to cancel their flights, keep flying, and kind of go, it's not going to be contained. So now, as you can see, there are dozens or more countries that have it by this black line. Still nothing being done. And then here we see all 50 states have confirmed infections. Then it's declared a global pandemic. Still nothing really going on. This is just kind of just letting it spread. Now it's spreading further and further. And here's where we start to get to some real issues. One of the problems that people have complained about with the COVID-19 outbreak is the numbers that we get from the Chinese authorities have changed because they've changed the ways that they count them. And there's a lot of people on the internet that accuse China of lying about their numbers and, oh, it's much higher, it's much higher. So to all those people out there who think that China's been underreporting their numbers. Right now, we think that there's about 80,000 cases. Obviously, that number will go up as more are discovered. But how much do you think that they're actually deflating it by? Do you think the real number is 10 times the amount that they're saying? I mean, that would be 800,000 people. And how mad would you be if you found out that the 80,000 that China's telling us it is actually 8 million people? Remember how you feel about that. Here, the CDC reports that there are 27,717 cases, including suspected cases. The real number is closer to 10 to 14 million. Here, Harvard did a survey which said that 62% of people wash their hands more and 16% avoid large gatherings. So this gives you some insight into how people were thinking about this disease. No one cared. 16% said that they will avoid large groups. And remember, unlike Mexico, the United States at this time was totally open. Anything you want, biggest rock concerts, whatever, it doesn't matter. Anything you want to do, huge groups. The advice that they were giving out is if you are sick, stay home, try not to be around too many people, things like that.
If you get sick with swine flu, CDC recommends that you stay home from work or school and limit contact with others to reduce the chance of transmitting the infection.
Here, the CDC says students and school workers with suspected cases should go home and stay there for 7 days. More spreading, just lots and lots of spreading. Costa Rica's president gets infected. More spreading. At this point, the CDC just stops recording H1N1 cases officially. And they tell states, you know what, just report them however you want. And they publicly acknowledge that some states will report the H1N1 virus cases with the normal flu. Some will report them separately, and that there will be widespread confusion about the data. They don't care. They just literally tell states, just report it however you want. Colombia's president got infected. That's 2 presidents in the world that got infected by this disease, which to this point, I don't know what anyone has done to try to stop any spreading of it. All I see is some reports saying, it's no big deal and there's nothing we can do about it. Mexico seems to be very aggressive about it. America, nothing. I mean, what is on here? Then there's this period of time in which there are no deaths reported that was questioned by some news agencies. NBC brought it into question and said, hey, why is there magically no deaths for such a long amount of time? Vaccine was approved by the FDA. Here we see China, back then, starts deploying vaccine to Chinese people, and their efforts are described as China is at the forefront of international efforts to produce an H1N1 influenza vaccine. So back to America, many schools shut down. CDC declares a public health emergency and sends some travel warnings. CDC report widespread infection. And here, the US starts deploying vaccines. And this may sound familiar. Some researchers start accusing the United States of creating the virus in a laboratory and leaking it. More spreading. Vaccine industry on this day was reported as booming. 48 of 50 states are still infected on the day that President Obama declared a national emergency. I want you to know, by the way, this is the President of the United States declaring an emergency. From the time I'm filming this, the President would be declaring a national emergency 5 months from now. Not really much else is done. More spreading. And then something interesting happens. CBS and Wall Street Journal report that the case numbers are wildly exaggerated. It's not nearly as high as the CDC is reporting, when in fact they were reporting a tiny, tiny fraction of the real numbers. More spreading. Here, CDC reports 22 million cases in America.
The CDC estimates that 22 million Americans have gotten the virus.
Sound like a lot? It's actually not even half the real number. Associated Press and NBC investigate and say that the CDC is intentionally misleading the public about cases and deaths. Then, magically, 2 days later, they say, oh, actually, it wasn't 22 million. It was 50 million. Whoops, more spreading. Again, just a lot of dead air here, just a lot of dead time. Now, the equivalent of 8 months from today, my time, the president encourages the public to get vaccinated. And maybe you've heard something like this before. The WHO is accused of being owned by pharmaceutical companies. China Southern and Eastern Airlines started enforcing cabin disinfection and masks. Meanwhile, on the same day, the CDC didn't recommend wearing masks, and US airlines made no significant changes to standard procedure. Quote, "We're not taking the type of precautions that are unnecessary." By the time that they're saying this, by the way, there's actually about 65 million people in America with this infection. Goes on and on. CDC later says there were actually up to 89 million cases. A lot more nothing, more accusations that the WHO is owned by pharmaceutical companies. At this point, the WHO predicts 2 billion cases in the world. And here, the H1N1 pandemic phase is finally declared over. Meanwhile, more reporting in America, saying that the past H1N1 vaccinations were, quote, inappropriate and unnecessary. Here, the American CDC estimated they thought that Beijing actually had up to 2.3 million infections. Here, a study comes out saying that 11 to 21% of the entire world's population were infected by H1N1 virus. Now you understand why these don't have curvature, because the CDC was reporting numbers that were about 1% or less of the real number for most of this time. So it's totally pointless to even use their numbers, because they admit at the end of all this, when everything's said and done, when it's way too late to change anything, that's when they say, oh, actually it was more like 90 million people in the entire country. Cases of deaths are also muddied because the CDC just basically told states they can report however the hell they want to. So we don't really know the amount of deaths, but we do know the high range of the estimated deaths in the world is around 500,000. So now when we look at these cases again, it really puts things into perspective. It is definitely the worst dealing of an outbreak in the 21st century. I don't know how you could handle something like this worse. I mean, I guess you could have not shut down the schools. That's pretty much all they did. To me, as an American, this is actually really embarrassing. Thankfully, the mortality rate for this virus was very low. Otherwise, we could have seen hundreds of millions of deaths. 11 to 21% of the population were infected. The mortality rate is very important. 11 to 21%. You're talking of 6.8 billion people at the time. If this virus had a higher mortality rate, we would have seen people dying in the tens of millions or more. And when you look at this timeline, you can see why it happened. The US basically just did nothing except tell everybody a bunch of fake numbers, close some schools, encourage people to travel, and kind of say, yeah, it's too late to do anything. I mean, this timeline is so long. It's so long. It just goes and goes and goes. And there's nothing in it. It's just this barren, empty timeline. There's a few things that they did, there's some regional things that they did. They don't match up with the caliber of things that are happening in China. In the beginning, maybe Mexico screwed things up, we're not sure. But they definitely got their stuff together and they locked it down in their country the best they could. Meanwhile, America went with a totally opposite approach. They basically just didn't seem to care about it at all and just let it spread all over the world. This is not a thing about blame, but this is just a way to show you that I don't know what planet people are living on when they tell me that the H1N1 was amazing, it was done so quickly. Look at the data. The data tells you that this was handled very poorly, extremely, extremely poorly. People were very upset about it after the fact. It was an absolute nightmare. Meanwhile, in China, by the way, for this H1N1 outbreak, they took things way more seriously than America did.
In China, where SARS infected thousands just 6 years ago, the response to this flu outbreak has been swift, and some might say severe.
In fact, of all the countries that got infected, America is maybe the one that took it the least serious. They didn't seem to care. I mean, where are you seeing that they give a damn that everyone is sick? I'm not seeing it. You guys have got to stop with all the excuses and the justifications and all the reasons why it's okay for you to attack China when China is actually doing a great job. And for those of you who say, oh, you can't compare it to H1N1, I've already compared it to SARS. I'm comparing it to H1N1. What else would you like me to compare it to? Because everything I compare it to, it outperforms. What China is doing today is not perfect, but every time I look at the timeline of another outbreak, I see that it's much faster than that outbreak. So I hope that after seeing this video, we can all agree in one thing at least. Thank God that the Chinese government hasn't just sat around issuing proclamations of, oh, it's too late, it'll probably just spread anyway. I mean, what's the point? No need to close borders. No need to stop any flights. This timeline's not perfect. There are a few things I left out, but they're not big. And if you think that there's something I'm missing, please let me know and I'll add it to future versions. And try to remember, guys, not everything is how people are telling you that it is. Do your own research. And on my way out, I'm gonna leave you with a present. And that present is gonna show you just how aware of the disease people were back then, and the overall feeling that people had towards it. Thanks, everybody. 谢谢.
H1N1 swine flu infection. For intervention, I bring prevention. Dr. Clark, here I come to make your head numb. Health hot, lesson 1 to stop the bedlam. If you think you infected, seek attention. If you haven't, stay at home so you don't spread none. Use tissues when you sneeze, cause you could spread some. Cause coughed up germs is where it spreads from. I'm recommending washing hands for protection, front and back real thorough while you count 20 seconds. Hand sanitizer, I advise you get it. Why? It makes germs die when you rub and let it dry. Don't touch your eyes, your mouth, your nose, your face. That's how you get infected, so you better play it safe. Long-term outcome, we'll see the end come. Never sick again from the H1N1.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Clark.